Good morning, good afternoon. It's a little chilly here. About 6:30 in the morning. Just finished practicing and got the question about, is yoga, and or the question is how to balance yoga and more modern forms of exercise. And I was sharing a little bit of my personal story with that. And so I want to share kind of my own journey in terms of more modern forms of exercise, and then how yoga practice can either replace or bring balance to our approach with exercise. And it's a bit of a philosophical question. I'd like to kind of share a little bit of the context behind my response, my answer to this question. And hopefully that can be helpful or supportive to someone. The thing that I think about when it comes to the activities that I choose to invest time into, right? Like exercise is an activity that requires time and energy and motivation and willpower. And we have a finite amount of willpower, right? We have a finite amount of the ability, the juice necessary to take meaningful action in our life. And that's important to recognize, because everything that we create, everything that we generate in our life is something that in one way or another requires some amount of that willpower, some amount of our intentional, directed action and intention towards the manifestation of some result. And this is how things get created. And so my inquiry for myself, and also for anybody who is interested in understanding how to, I guess you could say, live a life that our actions and the results that we are pursuing, or the manifestations that we're orienting to, are aligned with what we really want. You know what I mean? I find that in the past, this is a little bit of my personal history, when I first started practicing yoga, I came to yoga practice as my goals were to allow myself to recover, basically, from being beat up in my exercise regimen. And I found that yoga was actually giving me energy that allowed me to then train harder, to exercise harder. And so I took the energy that my yoga practice was giving me, and I put that energy back into my exercise regimen, which didn't really end up creating the abundance of energy that I actually was looking for, but I didn't know that at the time. Does that make sense? What I was really looking for by practicing yoga was that increase in energy, and creative energy, willpower to do the things that I really wanted to do in my life. And because I didn't have clear objectives about what I wanted to do with that energy when I received the abundance of it, I put it back into the patterns or the habits that, for whatever reason, I thought were bringing me what I thought I wanted. And I share that personal story just because I think that the question or the inquiry that's really important is, what activities are going to help me increase my energy, increase my creative capacity, increase my generativity in life? Because as I increase my creative capacity or my generativity, I'm able to put more energy into the things that I really love. And I'm able to create more or manifest more of those things. And over time, as I started to realize, oh wow, yoga's giving me energy and I'm just kind of hemorrhaging that energy. It's kind of a strong word, but that energy was just leaking out of the exercise that I was choosing. And granted, the exercise that I was choosing was not necessarily what I would consider the healthiest. It was very extreme with weightlifting and what I ate, these sorts of things. And my system started to become more and more sensitive. And as my system became more sensitive, the way that I approached exercise changed. Like it had to. It wasn't something that I consciously decided. The system started to adapt, and the ways that I was forcing myself before that I wasn't aware of started to become more and more apparent. And so the ideals of yoga started to manifest, right? Like things like ahimsa, the first ideal or the first yama of yoga, according to Patanjali, nonviolence. So as I started to practice yoga and the ideals of yoga started to become more and more alive and more present for me, I started to see, oh, I'm actually able to practice yoga in everything I'm doing. Or maybe it was more accurately put, it's like my system started to crave that sort of activity because I realized somewhere intuitively and internally, or the body started to wake up to this, that those were the things that actually really brought me pleasure and joy and happiness and balance, and the experiences of harmony, not just in the activity itself, but the cultivation of the qualities of harmony. And as I started to intentionally cultivate those qualities, they started to permeate every other area of my life, which I think is useful to observe, it's useful to point out, it's useful to reflect on, it's useful to share, I think. And where I'm at now today in understanding this path of yoga is looking at what activities are yogic, I guess you could say, in the sense that my system might need exercise, or it might need a stronger practice, or it might need this particular kriya or this set of asanas, or I might feel like I need to do some sort of exercise that might not be considered yoga. You know what I mean? But intuitively, the system is craving or requiring that in some way. And the way that I approach that activity and the way that I execute it and align with it ends up feeding me the energy that I'm looking for. And as the energy comes in, if I'm paying attention, then I notice where that energy is going, or I notice what it's doing. And this is what I think sadhana is or describes, because sadhana isn't necessarily just what we do in that 20 or 30 minutes or that hour or whatever we've allotted to our spiritual practice in the morning or in the evening or whatever, the daily allotment of our attention specifically on our spiritual development. That's what we would call sadhana. Eventually, the things that we cultivate in sadhana and the things that we focus on and are aware of in sadhana, they permeate everything else that we do. And so therefore, everything becomes sadhana. And I believe that exercise can be yogic, right? And at the same time, what we call yoga, it can be exercise. You see what I mean? And so the question would be how to approach the activity that we're doing to imbue it with the qualities that we're looking to cultivate and not take away from those qualities, right? Not to reinforce the patterns or the habits that we're wanting to free ourselves from. And this is really important. This is the path of yoga, to move towards freedom, to move towards balance, to move towards harmony. And it's just as easy to approach a yoga practice and reinforce the things that we're trying to heal or transform. And therefore the yoga practice becomes like exercise. And it's same thing, we can approach exercise from the perspective of the yogic path and what we're trying to cultivate, and therefore the exercise can become yogic. You see what I'm saying? So it's really the mindset, it's really the attitude, it's really the understanding of what we're trying to accomplish, looking at it from a holistic perspective, in the perspective of sadhana. Like, the word sadhana means the way of attainment. So what is it that we're trying to attain? And are we choosing the most efficient and effective route to do that? And the last thing I'll say in conclusion of this share, I hope this is helpful. If you're enjoying these videos, your support's so appreciated, and subscribing to the channel is one way that you can support these sharings from me and the teachings from yoga and tantra. And yeah, the last thing that I'll say is, in conclusion, the approach, the attitude, and the way that we see our development spiritually, it's useful to have sort of a perspective of what we think is possible for us. Yeah, and so even if we're in a state of compromised health, which I was in a really compromised position in my health and very imbalanced, I started to imagine what life could be like if I was feeling really good. Yeah, I started to feel like, because I didn't have energy to do things that I maybe wanted to do. And I started to imagine what it would be like to have that energy, to be in a state of creative flow, in a state of inspiration, in a state of service. And that feeling of like, oh wow, life can actually be a lot more expansive than the way I'm currently living it, allowed me to kind of hone in on not just the activities that I needed to do, the lifestyle that I needed to live, but the way to do that. Yeah. And so that's, I guess, what I wanted to leave you with, as it's very important that we understand what we're doing and why we're doing it, where it's coming from, and where we want to go with it. Because then everything can become sadhana, and everything can become the cultivation of the ideal that we are cultivating or wanting to cultivate. And I believe that that's how we end up living a very aligned life, that our words, our actions, our thoughts, basically everything that we are intentionally choosing to do and be, it's all aligned. And I believe that that's one of the ways, at least in the way of the yogic path, that we approach a life of fulfillment and joy and, yeah, happiness. So, hope that's helpful, and thanks for joining me. Be sure to tune in, because there'll be more videos coming out each week as I share more about the spiritual sciences of yoga and tantra. Enjoy your practice. Namaste.